So today I thought it would be a good idea to talk a bit about trainee PWP applications, in particular how to write a personal statement that gives your application the best chance of being shortlisted for an interview. So the way I'm going to illustrate my points here is by using my own trainee PWP applications. So I've got two personal statements in front of me here. One of these was unsuccessful and the other one was successful. So I'll be comparing both of these statements and using them as examples. So tip number one is to use the person specification, and I know this is like the most obvious tip in the world, but you really can't get started on an application without doing this. So every job listing usually comes with a person specification, and this is a comprehensive document that would list all of the criteria used to shortlist applications during the hiring process. So make sure you read the person specification and make sure you write your personal statement in a way that hits most, if not all, of the points on the person specification. So this is something that I did with both of my personal statements. The difference between my unsuccessful application and my successful one was structure. So in my unsuccessful application, I didn't use any subheadings. It was literally just a blob, a wall of text. And in my successful application, I used subheadings according to the person specification. So these were like educational requirements, and then I think it was skills, experience, knowledge base, and then it went into personal aptitudes, and then finally additional requirements. Now, obviously, subheadings are not the most important thing in the world, but I found them really useful in terms of presenting what I wanted to say in a structured and concise manner. So if you're worried about a word count limit, then obviously don't bother using them, but it can be quite helpful to draft your personal statement using the subheadings that I found in the person specification. It's just basically a good way of structuring your thoughts. Tip number two is to research IAPT services, the step care model, and the PWP role. And this is basically a long-winded way of saying know what you're getting into. Have a basic understanding of how IAPT services came to be, what the rationale is behind the step care model, how it works, and most importantly, how the PWP role fits into all of that. And if you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, then I will link some videos below that will give you a better understanding of what the role entails. And really the reason why you should do this before embarking on your personal statement is because the PWP role isn't just about working with people with common mental health problems. It's a very niched role in a very specific system. And if you don't know what that role entails and you don't know what system it works in, then how are you going to convince the hiring gods that you're the right candidate for the role? For example, you may have experience in healthcare where you work with a limited number of people and you give them all the time in the world, and your priority is really to give them the best care possible. And in your personal statement, you talk about prioritizing quality over quantity, for example, because that's what you value in your work. And it sounds absolutely incredible. The problem is the number one slogan when it comes to PWP work is high volume, low intensity caseload. And what that means is you see a large number of clients who in theory require low doses of therapeutic interventions. So while quality of work is absolutely crucial, PWPs also deal with quantity. So if you're slagging off quantity and high volume caseloads in your personal statement, then you probably want to reconsider applying. Another example, and I'll use my personal statements here. So in my unsuccessful application, I spent a whole paragraph just talking about my research experience. I go into an insane, obnoxious amount of detail about eye tracking technology, experimental procedures, and data analyses. Very impressive. The problem with that is nobody cares, because PWP work is very clinical by nature and there is very little scope for research in a traditional PWP role. So that paragraph bragging about being research assistant, absolute waste of space. Now, in my successful application, I pretty much dropped it entirely. Didn't say a word about my research experience, not because it wasn't useful, but because I couldn't find a way to include it in a way that would be relevant to the PWP role. I only alluded to my research experience in the context of time management, and that's something I'll talk a bit about later. But basically, I didn't even use the phrase research assistant anywhere in the personal statement that was successful. Now, if you do have research experience, I'm not saying that you shouldn't talk about it in your personal statement. Oh my God, that's not what I'm saying at all. All I'm saying is you have to write it in a way that makes it relevant to the role. For example, if your research experience is in anxiety and depression and it gives you a better understanding of common mental health problems, then write about that. Personally, I couldn't find a way to relate my research experience to the PWP role, so I basically just chickened out and dropped it entirely. I have so many other painful examples, but I feel like I should have made my point clear by now. Basically, research the PWP role and tailor your personal statement accordingly. There's no point showcasing all these things that you think other people might be impressed by if it's not relevant to the role at all. Tip number 3, and this is a big one. Don't talk about clinical psychology or high intensity CBT or counselling. Please, please, please remember that you are applying to be a trainee PWP so you can be a qualified PWP. I know that a lot of people use the PWP role as a stepping stone to other roles such as the clinical doctorate, and I don't have a problem at all with that. That's a separate conversation. But from a hiring perspective, it's not a great idea to tell people you have aspirations to move on as quickly as possible. Also, if you research IAPT services, you would know that there is a struggle in the industry to retain the workforce. So even if your intentions are to train up eventually or to use it as a stepping stone for something else, don't put that in your personal statement, because the person going through your application will take one look at the phrase planning to pursue a career in clinical psychology and they will automatically ditch your application. Now, of course, I've never been on any hiring panel, so what do I know? But I think it's safe to say that just using common sense, make it clear that you want the PWP role that you're applying for, not a doctoral trainee role that has got nothing to do with this particular application. And by the way, if it's not obvious enough, yes, in my unsuccessful application, I literally talked more about the DCPsy than I talked about the PWP role. So needless to say, I never heard back. Tip number 4, time management. Now, time management is not a joke. Time management, or organizational skills, which is the umbrella that it falls under, is something that you pretty much find in every person's specification. Employers are always going to say that they want someone with good organizational skills, good time management. The thing that you need to know is when it comes to the PWP role, they actually mean it. They actually do want someone who can manage the time well, and the reason for that is, once again, our all-time favorite PWP slogan, high volume caseload. So in my unsuccessful application, I'm so fixated on trying to describe all the experiences that I have in detail that I completely forget to talk about time management. In the unsuccessful personal statement, if you read it very closely, you'll be able to tell that I juggled full-time masters and 3 separate part-time roles, one of which was a research position and the other one was a clinical role. So it's very... So it is evident that I'm not a stranger to time management. The problem is whoever's reading the personal statement is probably skimming through it. They've got so many applications to go through. So with that unsuccessful one, that blob of text with no subheadings, they're not going to come to the conclusion that this person has good time management skills if it's not explicitly stated. They're going to come to the conclusion that this person actually doesn't know how to write. Conversely, in my successful application, I explicitly state that I did a full-time master's alongside working 3 separate part-time roles, 2 of which were demanding clinical research roles. I then go on to say how that's helped me in terms of building up time management skills. I then go on to talk about energy management and resilience and why that's even more important in some ways than time management, and how I manage myself from that perspective. And that's something that I blabbed a lot about in my interview, but that's a separate story. I also talk about a non-clinical role that I worked that required me to basically manage more than 100 people on my caseload at any given point, and how I coped with that high volume. So again, you see sort of linking back to the PWP role. And in my unsuccessful application, I don't even mention that non-clinical role, because I thought, oh, it's not a clinical role, it's not relevant. Well, turns out it kind of is, yeah. So think about what time management means to you. Don't do the cliche thing of just saying you're good at managing your time if you're not. Think of actual examples where you've been literally pushed to your limits. Talk about what that means for you, how you dealt with it, and how you would deal with it moving forward. Tip number 5 is do not discount the importance of the therapeutic alliance. So just thinking about the PWP role again. On paper, a PWP assessment is approximately 45 minutes and the treatment session is about 35 minutes. You typically have between 6 to 8 treatment sessions with any given patient. So if you think about it, PWPs don't have all the time in the world to deliver sessions, but you still need to capture information, you still need to deliver treatments, you still need client engagement. So what does that mean? That means you need to build strong rapport with your client and you need to do it fast, which means you also need to have some skill in that area. So what I used to illustrate this in my statements were both of the AP roles that I work. In my unsuccessful application, like I said earlier, I'm so fixated on making sure that the reader knows everything that I do. It ends up being really descriptive. I talk about participating in groups, later on running groups and individual sessions, and it's all about me, and what I've done and how amazing I am. But it's very surface level in the sense that there's no real reflection or understanding of what it is that I've done or learned. Conversely, in my successful application, I start off this section by saying how one of the most useful parts of being an honorary AP was actually observational, and this was through watching experienced psychotherapists repair ruptures. And I talk about how I watched this happen live in real time. These ruptures are happening, how they actively impact client engagement in the moment, and how rupture repair can foster that safe collaborative environment and sort of return everything back to baseline. So I'm not even talking about what I've done, it's just what I've observed. And then I talk about how I put this into practice in the future in my full-time AP role, where now it's not just observational anymore, I am actually running sessions and I have to do them successfully. And the way that I do that is by building a strong therapeutic relationship and really fostering that collaborative environment and making the client feel like they do want to work with me. And finally, I tie it all back to how that's relevant to PWP work. So for this tip, I would say think about your experiences in building a working relationship with any of the clients that you've worked with and reflect on that and shape that accordingly in your personal statement. The very, very last tip that I have for you is, yes, very cliche, but very, very important to me, and that is authenticity. I personally believe that none of these tips or any advice you can get regarding your personal statement, none of it is worth a grain of salt if you can't maintain an element of authenticity. And what I mean by that is a lot of things. I suppose it's how you write, how you present yourself, but it's also having a working knowledge of who you are as a person to some extent. So that would take quite a bit of reflection and a bit of time to build up if that's not something that you're familiar with. So in terms of how you write, in my unsuccessful statement, I basically wrote it in a day, but my heart just wasn't in it. It was an application with a service that was about 3 hours away from me. I don't have a car or any viable way of actually working there. So I was basically applying just for lols. So I ended up writing something just for the heck of it. It turned out to be a very descriptive version of my CV. It had zero soul in it. It was so dull, it was so cold, and I'm genuinely not surprised that I never heard back. Contrary to that, for my successful application, I also wrote it in a day, but when I was writing it, I was very much in flow. I was in the zone and I felt like I was really pouring myself into this statement. And it wasn't just a descriptive piece about my experiences and my accomplishments. Instead, it was more of a narrative. So that narrative, that story, offered insight into where I've come from, what I've learned from my experiences, and how I'm hoping to move forward as a person, as a professional, as a clinician. And more than that, I talked about things that were deeply, deeply meaningful to me. So, for example, what I thought about mental health, what I thought about mental health infrastructures that are currently in place. I also talked about just contributing to building a more resilient community. I want to empower people to advocate for themselves, to take back that autonomy over their mental health, just stuff like that. Another example that I can think of in terms of writing is when I talked about my befriending experiences, for example. So in my unsuccessful statement, the focus was very much on what I was doing. So I was working full time, and I was doing evening volunteer shifts, and I was doing night shifts, and those night shifts were 10 hours long, and then I'll go into work the next day in my full-time role, and how amazing and resilient is that? And I was very fixated on letting the reader know that I could do things, and part of that was because I was really proud that I was able to do those things, mainly because I was just that's new to me, you know, being able to do things like that. Sounds a bit odd without context, but let's just roll with it. Whereas in my successful application, it was a little bit more reflective and a little bit more storytelling. So I talked about befriending, yes. And I talked about how emotional support varies according to people. It differs depending on who's calling in. So some people are depressed, some people are really anxious, some people want to die, some people don't want to die, they just want to escape, some people need signposting. But the thing that I noticed in each one of them was this very universal sense of suffering. And I talked about how, as a fresh-faced volunteer, fresh out of training, that suffering was very, very, very overwhelming for me. And as I grew into being a more seasoned volunteer, I just got really frustrated with the system, because it was just emotional support, and we couldn't really help anyone beyond that. And I felt like I had more to offer and I could do more, and that feeling has sort of informed my choices since then, and informed some of the decisions that I've made in terms of wanting a career in mental health. So I talked a bit about that, and then that segued really well into my thoughts about IAPT services, why I'm interested in the PWP role, and it builds a really strong foundation for that. So that's how I write. I tend to write in a very storytelling way. I like a good narrative that's got a good foundation, a good rationale for why you're doing the things that you're doing. And not everyone writes like that. Everyone's got a different style, but I do think to some extent you do have to write in a way that showcases your authentic self. So to summarize all of that, number 1, use the person specification. Number 2, research the PWP role. Number 3, don't talk about clinical psychology. Number 4, don't underestimate the value of showcasing time management in the PWP application. Number 5, talk about your experience in building a therapeutic working relationship. And lastly, number 6, I think that's what we're on, write in a way that is authentic to yourself. And bonus tips that have sort of been sprinkled throughout the video, really. Be more reflective and less descriptive. So don't just describe your experiences, write about what you think, what you felt, what you've learned, how you would do things differently, if you would do things differently. Second bonus tip, link everything back to the PWP role that you're applying for. So everything that you write about has to have a purpose, and the purpose is to highlight why you're a suitable candidate for a trainee PWP role. The purpose is not to validate your feelings, it's not for you to wank off to your accomplishments, it's not that at all. Just link everything back to the PWP role. I think that's pretty much it from me today. Thank you so much for watching if you did. I will link some resources below that I personally found to be very helpful when I was looking at applying to be a trainee, just when I was researching the role in general and really considering it as a career, I suppose. So I will link all of that below. If you have any thoughts, you know I love thoughts. I love any thoughts. Leave them down in the comments below. That is very welcome and very appreciated. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.